All right, we hit the 0-0. So welcome everybody to our closing session. I am really excited to introduce our capstone speaker today, Catherine D'Ignazio. She is Assistant Professor of Urban Science and Planning at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. She's also the director of the Data Plus Feminism Lab, focusing on gender and racial justice related to space and place through data and computational methods. She also authored the book Data Feminism with Laura Klein, advocating for ethical data science practices. And this book begins by explaining its use of the word feminism, which is often assumed to only concern women. The book's feminism is a broad one, invoking a much larger mission that have emerged through various waves of feminism to examine systems of power and oppression and work towards co-liberation. Data feminism, then, is about examining the uses and limits of data from the perspective of power with a commitment to action. She holds a master's degree from the MIT Media Lab and an MFA from Maine College of Art. And she was a Tufts undergrad with a BA in International Relations. Woo, Tufts.
Go Jumbos.
So,
Go Jumbos.
Yeah, if you want to share your slides.
They should be shared. Do you see them?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're shared.
Yeah, we see them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
All right, I can take it away.
Yes.
Hello, thank you so much. Thanks to the VIS Organizing Committee for the invitation to be here with you. I do want to recognize the tremendous amount of work that the organizers have done to pivot the conference to online with about a week's notice. And to just thank you for doing that. And it was pretty seamless. And also I wanted to send all of our collective thoughts down south to the folks impacted by these two hurricanes over the past couple of weeks. And then also thanks to Lace, to Arvin, to Michelle, to the whole Boston Viz community for making this live presentation possible. It is so much nicer to speak to an actual room of people than it is to be at home and have my cats jumping into the frame. So today I'm going to speak about visualizing inequality. But first, I have a short announcement, actually. So I noticed attending the conference how many students are looking for jobs. So I have a job that is looking for people. So we are currently hiring. I'm on the search committee. We're looking for an assistant professor of urban planning, computing, and health of the planet. This is a position that would be in the urban planning department, but you have a dual appointment with College of Computing. So if you know anyone or if you are that person, please get in touch with me. I'm really happy to help folks frame their applications for this somewhat complicated interdisciplinary position where you have to speak to both urban planners and computer scientists. So yeah, just a brief plug. Okay, so we'll get started. First, I want to thank the Wampanoag Nation and the Massachusetts peoples on whose lands I'm typically a guest, and I am today a guest, and also on whose lands I completed much of the work that I'm talking about today with you all. So speaking about inequality as an important topic, this week, 3 economists, 2 of whom are actually at my institution, won the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work on global inequality. And so I thought that was really interesting and timely. So their research investigates the relationship between inequality and long-term prosperity at the scale of the nation state, so at the scale of the country. And what they find is that countries with inclusive institutions, so they define that as countries that protect individual rights and countries that allow for widespread economic participation, those countries end up on a pathway to longer-term prosperity. But on the flip side, countries with extractive institutions and with high levels of inequality. So these are extractive institutions or institutions that basically help elites to maintain control of the systems and the economy. Those countries only provide short-term gains for people in power and are not on the path towards long-term prosperity. So these folks are focusing on inequality at this kind of very macro global scale. But today I want to talk about visualizing inequality based on race, gender, and class. And I'm going to focus it a little more narrowly kind of inside the United States and also across Latin America. Those are the sort of geographies that I'll be talking about. And the reason I focus there is because those are the dimensions of inequality that I have the most expertise in. They're the ones that I study the most, both in the US and transnationally. But I would welcome folks in this audience. I mean, I know the VIS community is a very international community, so I would welcome you to bring in other dimensions of social, political, economic inequality, particularly if you're from outside the US context, and inequality may look different in the place that you're in, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. So to get started, visualizations of inequality are everywhere in public communication. And here I'm going to just run quickly through a couple of examples. These are just things we encounter. We encounter them in the news. We encounter them in policy reports. We encounter them on TV, broadcast. And I want to show you these examples, but then I also want to confess some of my doubts to you about the work that these visualizations do. So for example, sort of in line with the economist's work that I was talking about, comparing inequality across nations and regions, this is a line chart from the nonprofit Equitable Growth. It's demonstrating that over a 40-year period, income inequality in the US is rising more rapidly than in Europe. Within the United States context, income and wealth are stratified by race, due to longstanding histories of exclusion from housing markets, access to credit, and so on. And so this is a chart from the Federal Reserve Bank that sort of tries to quantify the wealth gap over time. And it shows us that the typical white family has around 10 times the wealth of a typical Black family in the United States. So here's one that's sort of near and dear to my own heart. So this is women in computer science. Again, a line chart showing change over time. This chart shows how in fields like medicine, law, and the physical sciences, they have made significant gains in terms of gender parity since the 1960s. While in fact, computer science has actually seen losses in gender parity. And this is, again, for the US context. And so here's a couple more kind of interesting charts from a visualization perspective. This is from a story in Scientific American from a couple of years ago. And this is about maternal mortality, so death in childbirth or immediately following childbirth. And it shows how it is, first of all, stratified by race. But second of all, it appears maternal mortality rates appear to be worsening over time for all groups except for Asian and Pacific Islanders. So you can kind of see here they're showing a time period between 2005 and 2014. And if the rate went up, there's this up arrow. And if the rate went down over that time, there's this dotted line down arrow. And so for almost all racial groups, the arrow went up over that time period. And then finally, many people are probably familiar with this animated visualization from the New York Times, a really incredible work. And it shows that Black boys and men in particular experience more downward class mobility than other racial and gender groups in the United States. And it's actually animated. If you haven't seen this piece, it's a pretty amazing piece of data storytelling. Okay, so these are all fairly sort of recent visualizations about various forms of inequality. And I want to say that these types of visualizations, so these narrative visualizations, communicative visualizations, I think they have a really important role to play in the public discourse around structural inequality, whether we're talking about inequality due to racism, patriarchy, economic inequality, some combination of those things or others. And I teach with a bunch of these examples as well. And so I think part of the power of visualization, specifically when it comes to inequality, is to reveal these sort of group-based, historical, and large-scale patterns at play in these inequalities. And yet, I want to raise a couple of doubts that I have about visualizations of inequality as we tend to encounter them. So first of all, are they doing the work that we want them to do? Are they actually accomplishing what we think we're accomplishing with them? And then what is it? What do we actually want to accomplish with these visualizations of inequality? And so I want to present 3 doubts. And they're not actually even at the level of critiques yet. They're like doubts. They're like questions in my mind. And they're doubts about this current state of affairs regarding visualizations of inequality. And it's how I'm trying to kind of merge them with the readings I've been doing over the past 5 years, which have been covering areas like data activism, community-based knowledge production, Latin American feminisms, and indigenous data sovereignty. So the first doubt I have, the first doubt is that I wonder if many of these visualizations of inequality repeat a kind of harmful pattern that Unanga scholar Eve Tuck calls damage-centered research. So damage-centered work focuses exclusively on the problems of communities, and particularly communities that face violence and inequality. And so when Eve Tuck is writing about this, she's actually critiquing social science researchers. She's not actually writing at all about visualization. So she writes about social science researchers and how they keep repeating this harmful pattern of using their research to document the brokenness, quote unquote, of Native American communities. And so she writes, one of the major activities is to document pain or loss in an individual, community, or tribe. So a community's oppression, what they don't have, their disadvantage, ends up sort of defining that community and also pathologizing that community. Maggie Walter, who's a Palawa scholar from Tasmania, and she's a leader in the scholarship on Indigenous data sovereignty. She actually has a related critique of data that researchers and governments present about Indigenous people. And she calls this 5D data, and it's data that only documents disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference. And so Eve Tuck's sort of antidote for damage-centered research is that she proposes that we undertake desire-centered research. And so this is work that strives to represent oppressed communities with more nuance, complexity, contradiction, and agency, and not reduce them to their problems. And so here I put the gender parity visualization for thinking about this, because for me, this relates to a frequent critique that I have of these sort of women in STEM visualizations. I feel like this is like a kind of whole genre of visualization where they are almost invariably focused on the women and documenting their absence. In this case, the visualization, so the framing, at least from the title, that where are the women, is not bothering to look into the decades of research that exist for why women aren't present in computer science. Something has happened to them. We don't know what. It's a huge mystery. So the question would be, you know, how do we insert more agency and complexity of women into this data visualization? How do we refocus our lens on some of the forces pushing women out of computer science, not just on these poor, lost, absent women, right? Like maybe they're wandering around the hallways looking for their classrooms. Like we just have like no idea. It's like huge mystery here. Okay, so that's the first doubt. Second doubt I have about visualizations of inequality relates to the theory of change that is sort of underlying when we try to depict inequality. What is our theory of change that's underlying this? Often it's implicit. We don't often, you know, I mean, I think if you ask designers, like, what's your theory of change? They wouldn't know how to answer you probably. But often there's a kind of implicit theory of change that underlies it. So for example, this wealth gap visualization is pointing out this 10x difference between the wealth of white and Black families in the United States. And so now that we see that, like we see that, we know that, what happens? What comes next? And so one of the like sort of implicit theories of change here is that, well, okay, it's our job, say, as visualization people to show the injustice of the world, and then somebody else can take action and fix it, right? But then who is that they? Who is the they that will then take action? So that theory of change is this kind of delayed action theory of change, which defers political action until to the realm of somebody else, the responsibility of somebody else at some later and undefined date. And then the second theory of change that's often kind of operating at work in these visualizations is something articulated again by Eve Tuck. And she frames it as being related to litigation discourse. So we depict damage, we depict this kind of difference, harms, injustice. So we do that so as to obtain particular political or material gains. So to try to get some kind of reparations or change the distribution of allocation of resources. But she poses the, I think, very important question, does it work, right? And most importantly, she says, are the wins, if there are material wins that come from this strategy, is it worth the long-term cost of thinking of ourselves as damaged? If we think of this work as actually doing some harm. And then my third doubt here relates to the unintended consequences of visualizations of inequality. So in the book Data Feminism, Lauren Klein and I interviewed the journalist and Black maternal health advocate. Her name is Kimberly Seals-Allers. She's a sort of national leader on this topic. And we interviewed her about Black maternal mortality data. And this is what she said. The statistics that are rightfully creating awareness around the Black maternal mortality crisis are also contributing to this doom and gloom narrative, deficit narrative. White people are like, how can we save Black women? And that's not the solution that we need the data to produce. And so it's important to think about this particular moment in time as well. There's a lot of other stuff going on other than just this particular visualization that you see here. So ProPublica had just released a huge story on Black maternal mortality. Harvard School of Public Health magazine, Scientific American, and then many other press outlets really started picking up this story, many publishing charts, actually not as good as this, various kinds of other charts. I actually really like this. This is from the Scientific American story, and I actually love this piece. But philanthropists were starting to donate. People were getting really activated about this issue. But we can hear in Seals-Allers' comment here, the frustration because of the ways, again, that these damage-centered narratives produce this savior complex in the white people and the white institutions who see themselves then as being charged with saving Black women rather than, let's say, foregrounding the many decades-long efforts that Black women themselves have been leading that are already addressing the crisis. And so I loved this piece. And so after a lot of this was going on, there was a very high-profile critique by 4 Black women doctors that were kind of critiquing this kind of savior energy. And the title of the article is An Inconvenient Truth. You have no answer that Black women don't already possess. An open letter to birth workers, clinicians, funders, perinatal and systems redesigners, and policymakers. Okay, so to summarize my doubts, visualizations of inequality may not only cause representational harm to the communities they may trying to be helping, but they also might have a kind of relatively weak and questionable theory of change. And then they might also end up producing this sort of savior complex in the dominant group, which is incredibly helpful to the marginalized group. So how might we do this differently? And I just do want to preview that I'm not going to like solve this. Basically, what I want to do is sort of orient us to where we can look to start doing things sort of differently. Okay, so to orient ourselves in another direction, I want to ask, what can we learn from grassroots data visualization? And the investigation that I've been doing and the research over the past 5 years has given me kind of new examples, new cases, and new relationships to think from. So what I want to offer this community today is not really like solutions or recommendations like do this and don't do that, and then you're going to be good. But rather like directions. So 3 lines of inquiry that can be followed by orienting ourselves to what grassroots groups are doing with data visualization and social movements for equality right now. And I'll come back to these and explain what they mean, because it probably isn't immediately apparent what these mean. So these directions come out of my latest book. It's called Counting Feminicide, Data Feminism in Action. Just came out from MIT Press this past spring. And the book documents the creative, intellectual, and emotional labor of feminicide data activists across the Americas, so North, South, Central America primarily. And I want to note that the book is open access, so you can just go and download it and read it for free. It's obviously great if you want to buy it, but it is also just open and available. And then the other thing I'll say is I did a really interesting multi-layered community review process as part of writing and revising the book, and I'm really happy to talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested. So let me tell you a little bit about feminicide and about the data activists who are working on feminicide. So my first encounter with their work was getting to know the work of Maria Salguero, who monitors feminicide in Mexico. And so what are we talking about here? Feminicide is actually a feminist concept that names the gender-related killings of women and girls. It includes cisgender and transgender women. It's a concept that has existed since the 1970s, but it's really kind of more recently become a rallying point for Latin American feminist movements. And feminicide as a concept tries to say that many different types of fatal violence against women are linked to women's gender subordination in a patriarchal society. So what that means is a fatal case of intimate partner violence would be called feminicide. But also murder in the context of sex work will be called feminicide. A hate crime against a trans woman would be called feminicide. So feminicide does not have a legal formulation here in the United States, but it is legally defined in almost all Latin American countries, including in Mexico, where Maria Salguero worked. However, the state does not systematically collect data on feminicide. And so this is a concept known as missing data. So this is where official, official data are absent, sparse, neglected, or even potentially manipulated. It is common across all countries that data on feminicide are missing. Like basically no country does a good job of collecting it. Feminicide is also the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America and beyond because of the way in which the state neglects to fully implement its own laws and provisions and protect the very basic rights of its people. So frustrated by the lack of information, Maria Salguero, who's depicted here, she has single-handedly compiled the largest archive of feminicide in the Mexican context. How does she do this? She spends 3 to 4 hours a day reading news articles about violence and logging feminicides into her database and on her Google map, which you see here. She has to take breaks for her own mental health because it's really excruciating work. It's very manual, it's very case by case, and she's reading many stories of brutal violence, and so she has to pause. Using her data, which she's now been collecting for 8 years, she's helped families locate loved ones, she's provided data to journalists and NGOs, and she's testified in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. And so Maria's work constitutes this practice of counter data production, a kind of a activist data production that steps in when the state and other institutions are systematically failing to ensure the basic human rights of their people. So Maria is actually quite famous. If people are from Mexico, you've probably heard of her. She's gotten a lot of attention. But in fact, there are many observatories, these sort of grassroots efforts that produce data about feminicide and document these human rights violations. And so our collaborative research team, which I'll tell you more about in a second, we've documented at least 190 of these projects around the world who do this work and who do it in a strikingly similar way, actually. And so one of the things that I think is very interesting that you can see, this is just a timeline of when these efforts started. We just plotted how many efforts started each year of the ones in our database. So data activism, we really see this form of data activism kind of jump after 2015, which is when the Ni Una Menos uprising happened in Buenos Aires and then spread really around the world. So I saw like hundreds of thousands of people turn out into the streets behind this hashtag Ni Una Menos, not one less woman is the implication. Okay. So I keep saying we and our research project. I just want to introduce you to my collaborators here. So I was actually living in Argentina in 2019 on sabbatical. I was revising data feminism at the time. And this is where I met these lovely people who you see here, who are now dear collaborators and friends. So Elena Suarez Val is the co-founder, or the founder, sorry, of Feminicidio Uruguay, which is similar work to what Maria Salguero does, but for Uruguay. So she herself is a data activist. Silvana Fumega at the time was the head of research for the Latin American Initiative for Open Data and has worked on some really interesting work on standardizing feminicide data for governments. And then Isadora Cruchen actually started with us as a PhD student and has now graduated and gone on to a faculty position, but also to lead the whole kind of Brazilian wing of our collaboration. And over the past 5 years, we've conducted in-depth interviews with 41 of these groups that collect and produce and then communicate feminicide data. And then we've also collaborated with 13 groups to co-design digital tools and participatory AI technology, which I'm not really going to be talking about today, but if you're curious, you can ask questions about it. As you can see, we've been primarily focused on the Americas in terms of where we interviewed and collaborated with people. Although recently we've started a collaboration with this group, Femicide Count Kenya, who's doing really amazing work in Kenya. Okay, so from here, I want to pivot back to some of the learnings from this research and specifically to what I think might be useful for visualization researchers. So this first learning comes from activists and social movements' use of alternative epistemological frameworks. And I was really struck, I went to the best paper presentations. I think this relates very directly to the paper by Daria Akbaba, Mariah Meyer, and Lauren Klein around various epistemologies and which epistemologies are we using in data visualization. And so just to refresh people's memories, because I feel like epistemology is a big word. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's about ways of knowing and ways of making knowledge. And so often we in academia, definitely in like North American academia, we're operating with epistemologies that are influenced by sort of Anglo-Western, often European, rationalist, positivist models for making knowledge. It's kind of the dominant mode. But those are not the only ways that knowledge can be made. And so one of the key concepts actually that Counting Feminicide theorizes together with activists and journalists, and we kind of co-created this concept with them, is this idea of a restorative and transformative approach to data science. And so this is an epistemological approach that I think might be particularly important when we're trying to understand structural inequality and also shift structural inequality. And in this case, we're talking about feminicide. So what's sort of different about how feminicide data activists undertake data science and then these sort of more mainstream understandings of data science? There's 4 chapters in my book about that, but I'm going to summarize it really quickly here. Feminicide data activists center care, memory, and justice. They are often from the communities that they draw their data from. They are women, they're Black women, they're Indigenous women, Latin American women, queer women, survivors, mothers, family members, relatives, and community members. And so when they do data science, when they collect data and communicate with data, they're not doing it to solve a problem of inequality. They're not doing it to solve feminicide, or actually they kind of are, but But actually, in fact, what they're doing is they're using data to remake and reframe the problem of feminicide and to challenge the idea that fatal gender-related violence is a personal problem, that it's, the husband just got so jealous and that's the cause of it, to reframe that as a political problem and a public problem. Feminicide data activists are deeply aware of the context that they're working in, meaning the biases and the limitations of their data, because they are themselves the data producers. Like they're literally manually, row by row, making the data every day. To use their words, they talk about their role as caring for the data and the people and the lives represented in the data. They are proximate and intimate to the data collection process, whereas often mainstream data scientists, myself included, are often working with second or third hand data, right? We inherit it from elsewhere. Data activists use their data to communicate to multiple audiences, ranging from families to the state, to media, to large scale publics, which I'm going to describe more about that in just a minute. So from our interviews with activists, as well as our technology and design collaborations, this led us to formulate the concept of restorative and transformative data science. So what is this? What does this mean? So this is an approach to working with systematic information about inequality with the twin goals of restoration and transformation. So restoration involves restoring rights, dignity, life, living, and vitality to the individuals, families, and communities and larger publics who are harmed by structural inequality. Restoration seeks first and foremost to reduce that harm, to repair relationships, and to heal. So to heal the material and the spiritual wounds that are left by violent and unequal systems of power. Restoration is also about restoration of rights. So things like the right to live a life free from violence, or the right to adequate housing, or the right to bodily autonomy, or the right to ancestral homelands. So where restoration is about healing and harm reduction and a kind of more short-term time frame, transformation involves work to dismantle and shift the structural conditions that produce the violence in the first place. So transformation is about long-term change, and it's both visionary and preventative. And I think it's really embodied by this quote from Laura Hernandez Perez from the Ghoniem group in Mexico. She says, "Our aspiration is to eradicate the violence. It is not about prevention, nor about managing it. Our dream is to eradicate all of the violences." And so this concept of restorative and transformative data science was developed very inductively and collaboratively. It's from observing and being in community with grassroots activists working with this data on feminicide over the past 5 years. But I think their approach has resonance for doing data science in other domains that are characterized by unequal power. So these kinds of durable structural inequalities, such as segregation, evictions, environmental harms, health inequities, et cetera. So I think this concept helps us move away from this idea that data are neutral somehow, and more that data can be used for healing and liberation from inequality. So I just want to kind of quickly note here that this alternative epistemology, this restorative and transformative data science, actually answers this question, like, what do we want visualizations of inequality to do? It answers that. So what we would want them to do within that epistemological framework would be to restore rights and to heal communities, and or to help, again, this would be like, how does it help? It doesn't do it on its own. And then to transform the structural and systemic conditions of inequality. So that it like basically poses the goals, the orientation points. Okay, so for this point, this first kind of direction or learning, I want to leave you with a couple of questions. And you'll note that I'm not giving you answers, I'm giving you questions. But so sort of how thinking from this alternative epistemologies, sort of how can visualizations of inequality support these restorative and transformative goals? I think that's a very open question. Can visual encodings and textual choices be aligned with theories of change? Can theories of change be more explicit in visualizations of inequality? What might those look like? how can visualizations of inequality foreground the agency of impacted communities, speaking back to that sort of like damage, kind of against the damage approach. Okay. Second, okay, I want to move a little more quickly. Second kind of takeaway here, this idea of embodied and emplaced visual grammars. What might this mean? So like I said, Ni Una Menos is the social movement against feminicide. The movement itself has actually developed a visual language whereby pink crosses and red shoes stand in for the women who have been killed in fatal violence. And you will see these symbols at protests and marches across the continent. Likewise, a project by the Métis artist Jamie Black uses red dresses to symbolize missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And actually, this project has also become a symbol, in this case for the movement against this violence. And you can see red dress installations in many Indigenous communities in North America, like US, Canada. And then many activist groups also use names, and mostly first names, to protect the identity of the people, to create data visualizations in public spaces. This particular project is the largest scale that I personally have encountered in this vein. So this was on International Women's Day in 2020. The artistic collective Colectiva SJF organized dozens of participants to paint the names of women killed in the prior year in Mexico. And I hope this picture can sort of give you a sense of the scale of what it took to put it together. So the letters, see the stencils there, they're massive. They're like maybe a meter high for each letter. And you can read women's names like Jacqueline, Yadira, Amada, Melanie, Maria Luz, Laura, Jasmine, and more. And importantly, this happened at a symbolic and historically important public plaza in Mexico City called the Zócalo. This is a major seat of governmental power, and it has been a public gathering point since pre-colonial times in Mexico. And so when it was finished, it looked like this. More than 200 names of women spiraled out from the flagpole that's in the center of the plaza. And then you can see that at the edges, the artist stenciled the mottos or the slogans, Ni una menos, not one woman less, and then Ni una más, not one woman more. And then this aerial documentation by Santiago Arau, it actually went viral over the internet. So really interesting also in terms of the choices that they made for how to document this and how to see this. Because of course, if you were participating, there was no way you could have this, view if you're kind of inside it. And then here's just a slightly more detailed shot of that same image, which I think here you can see the people a little bit better, gives you a sense of the scale. So the Mexican government showed up the next day after these massive protests for International Women's Day, and they scrubbed the plaza clean. And so they're really trying here to efficiently erase the names of the killed women, to suppress the record of the action, but in a way it was very fitting that they were unable to fully clean that space. So they left these really large white smudges and smears. And then what I think is also interesting is that the artist chose to include this as documentation of the work. And so this kind of makes this visual record that the government is unable to fully suppress the outrage and the public demands of the movement. All right, and then so the final example I want to show in this vein is this in 2021. This is in Argentina, in Rosario. The group Mujeres de Negro, women in Black, placed 250 empty chairs to symbolize the 250 women killed in feminicide in that year in Argentina, and to demand accountability from the government. And so here, the space of each chair, and they're actually also this group is also working with names as well, because each chair is named. And in some cases where they had permission from the family, they placed the photo of the person. And so the space here taken by each chair marks the volume of the woman's body, which is not is no longer present with us. So hopefully it's clear by now what I mean by these embodied and emplaced visual grammars. So all of these ways of visualizing feminicide data draw on this interplay between absence and presence. They're using articles at the scale of the body, things like shoes, chairs, individual names of people, and then multiply those and to this aggregate representation of collective loss and of mourning. And so in a way, they are presencing absence. It's a kind of way of making these design choices to kind of presence what is no longer with us, to make it felt, to observe what kind of quantity, the volume, the empty shoes, and so on. And then the other thing I think about in relation to these representations is their sightedness, their emplacement. So the sites that artists choose carry deep meaning here, and they add to the overall message of the visualizations. So they choose sites of governance, for example, to make political demands and to be like accuse or responsibilize certain bodies of governance. They choose streets to assert the rights of women to public spaces. They might choose trees for connection to the spiritual realm. So here's the questions that I offer here for this sort of second direction. Is really thinking through like, what is the role of place in visualizations of inequality? It's playing a huge role, at least in these, this particular set of things that I have shown you. It's inextricable, I think, from the meaning. And so what is that role? How do we think about that? And then how can visualizations of inequality simultaneously acknowledge human scale and structural scale? And that's one of the things that I think these visualizations do so effectively. But sometimes in tension as well, is sort of like the fact that they're acknowledging each individual person, their pair of shoes, their chair, while at the same time presenting us with this whole. So the cost of the like individual case of feminicide, the person that is lost, as well as the structural scale. And so I think there's like just some really interesting simultaneous scale work that's happening there. Okay, so the third and final learning that I want to talk about today relates to the very strategic political calculations of data activists. So I've been showing you these very expressive, creative, highly artistic visualizations, but not all of the groups communicate their data in this way. One of the fascinating things that I found about how activists choose to communicate their feminicide data is the flexibility of methods that they use and the alignment of their methods with their desired political outcomes. So that's kind of what I mean by the strategic part. So for example, groups that want to shift state policy and communicate with more or their primary goal is to sort of like reform policy or reform legislation, they will often choose sort of more bureaucratic, conventional, authoritative forms of visualization. And a good example of this is the Grupo Guatemalteco de Mujeres in Guatemala. They have been around, they're one of the longest running groups. They have been around for decades, I think almost 30 years at this point. The way that they communicate their data here is very kind of conventional bar charts. They publish reports in which they have bar charts, pie charts, kind of these standard forms of visualization that policymakers and legislators are familiar with, that try to speak with authority about the numbers. They have seen a number of successes. So they actually played a major role in the formation of some national institutions, like a National Forensics Institute, a federal scale commission on gender-based violence, and they helped to pass federal legislation on feminicide twice. So this is sort of like their chosen realm for where they want to have political impact is reform, state reform. And so their visualization choices are aligned with wanting to influence the state. But many activists actually want to target the media. And they want to target the media as a place to get their data published, as well as a place to insert a more feminist interpretation of gender-related violence. Because often when we think about sort of the ecosystem of things that are problematic in feminicide, the media are a major part of the problem. So media often report on feminicidal violence in ways that are misogynist, transphobic, victim blaming, racist. And so activists try to target the media for intervention. And so I think this media strategy is exemplified by Mumala in Argentina, where they create sort of more novel and shareable data visualizations with their statistics, again, the data that they themselves are producing, and then these can be very easily embedded into journalistic stories. And then what this also does is this sets them up for getting attention from major news outlets, getting them set up for interviews. And so they are often, you'll see them quoted throughout the Argentine press. So again, to kind of like insert that more feminist framing of feminicide into the press. And then finally, some groups target the general public. And so they use very creative methods to explain like an individual case from a larger database or a larger set of cases. So for example, one of the groups we interviewed that exemplifies this is Agencia Presentes. And so they do in-depth reporting on LGBTQ hate crimes, and they including trans feminicide and what's called travesticidio. So this refers to the murder of a person with the travesti gender identity. And so Agencia Presentes produces a map of these cases, which you can see here in the context of Argentina. But then there was a very high profile case of a major LGBTQ activist, Diana Sakayan. And so that what they actually did there was they produced this comic book that you see here. So they chose to try to make a comic book explainer as to why it was very, very important. It was like a major accomplishment for human rights movements that an Argentine court ruled that her death constituted what are called a travesticidio. It was the first time that particular terminology had been used, given a legal formulation. And so again, the goal here is to try to challenge stigmatizing narratives about LGBTQ people with this sort of in-depth explaining of a single data point. Okay, so the questions I would offer here are these. How can visualizations of inequality be tailored to different audiences to accomplish different political goals? So as we saw, activists use more expressive and less expressive ways of visualizing their data, depending on the audience they are targeting and what kinds of political goals that they have. So what kind of things might allow them that flexibility? And then secondly, one question I'm very interested in is how do we measure these political impacts of visualizations of inequality? I feel like this community, what I've seen this week, is very talented at developing measurement strategies. And often for complex things that you're like, there's no way to measure that. So I just want to throw that out there of like, what would be a way? This is a very complex phenomena, multi-sided. What are ways that we could measure how these things travel, what actually they do in the world, politically speaking? Okay, so we're at the end. I'll summarize where we've been. I offered you 3 doubts about the conventional ways of visualizing inequality. I offered 3 directions for thinking about how we might reorient ourselves in relation to visualizing inequality, and then 7 questions sparked by that reorientation. And I apologize for not giving you answers, but I think it's too preliminary, and I think it's up to us as a community to continue these kinds of conversations. So yeah, thanks for your time. Oh, and I just did want to point out, I thought this community would like this. This, you might see, and this is a photo from a protest on International Women's Day, along with enormous banners and puppets and paint and glitter and costumes. Activists are holding up infographics that they have made as part of the protest. And I just thought this was like the most amazing. It's like not a place where I would have expected these like infographic placards to be showing up. So yeah, so thanks so much for your time and attention. Really looking forward to more questions and conversations.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I'm going to hand it off to Remco to get us started with questions.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Really appreciate that talk. There's so much discussion happening right now on Discord. For those of you who are in the audience, I would encourage you to get on there and chat about this. So I will start with a question that's a little bit of a amalgamation of things that people post on Slido, as well as what I'm hearing on Discord. And this might be a little bit of a naive question, but it kind of goes as like, right, goes back to your talking about this damage-centered research.
Mhm.
And the question is, how can we address the potential risk of damage-centered research that pushes a harmful narrative while still ensuring that the needs of marginalized communities are brought to light? As a
Yeah.
community, especially as VIS people, how do we balance shifting the framing of negative representations without either whitewashing or purple washing historical and cultural harms?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, I think that is a major question and a huge question. And Eve Tuck actually does, she sort of offers us an answer in her essay. So her letter is actually called Suspending Damage. And so she offers us a way forward, which is this desire-centered research, but it is, yeah, not trying to, because I think, yeah, the flip side is like, oh, everything's fine, when of course that's not true. Like we can't just like gloss over structural inequality. We can't gloss over hundreds of years of marginalization or exclusionary policy or something like that. I think the way that she offers is to contextualize it more, so to provide more context. The answer that I would offer is the way to ensure it would be to be in dialogue with those communities and to be in community with those communities. And I think that is like your best insurance in a way that what you're doing, especially if you're not a member of that community, if you're doing it from the outside, as many of us find ourselves like working on things that are not issues that we have necessarily personally experienced. One of the best ways we can kind of accomplish that is by being in relationship and cultivating those relationships and having those folks at the table. There's challenges to that. I think there's time and resource challenges to that. But I think there's also costs to doing the sort of same old thing over and over again, especially when it may be causing harm to the communities that you're trying to be in allyship with. I mean, I think that's the question there. It's like, are you in allyship with those communities if you're not actually talking to them? I'm not convinced that that's actually doing anyone any good.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. I think that that helps clarifies, or at least gives us a direction to start thinking about. Kristi?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go to the Slido. So right now the top question is, embodied representations are so powerful. Can you speak more about the difference between a data visualization and an art installation?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes they overlap, right? Like I always say that some of the ones that I showed you all today are the same. So I would say and especially the installation in the Zocalo. I mean, that was done by a collective of artists. They consider it an artwork, and they also consider it a data visualization. They had a data scientist on their team as well. And so like, I think that those can be the same thing. And then I think sometimes they're not the same thing. And in fact, actually I have seen representations of the red dresses, for example, and there are many cases I've seen. Sometimes they have corresponded to an actual sort of number where they're trying to embody or at least proportionally represent a number by the amount of red dresses that they put up. But I have seen other installations which are they're not sort of trying to approximate any number, but really the red dress and the installation of, say, 5 to 10 red dresses is sort of standing in for the whole body or the innumerable body of people whose lives have been lost to this violence. And so that's a place where I feel like it's a little bit gray. Like, is that a data visualization? Like it's imprecise, but actually we also don't know the scale of the loss. We also don't know the scale of the numbers. So maybe it still is a data visualization, but I would say that's sort of an open question. But in any case, like for those examples, I would say their primary purpose is to be evocative. And that's sort of why they happen in these contexts of, they happen in very like affective, charged public contexts, often in the case of like marches, protests, particular days of the year, like International Women's Day or Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And so that is the purpose, that it's designed to be very sort of affective and to stage an encounter between an individual body, a member of the public, let's say, and the absent bodies of those who are not here.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. So sort of playing along with that and thinking about where we are today, at least in the US, where, we're very polarized, but at the same time, thinking about sitting with the communities that you're trying to help, but then also trying to express data and understanding of the problems and challenges to other people. Do you have any comments on making visualizations that sort of speak to both sides of a polarized audience?
Yeah. I mean, I would say in some cases, I would say, in which cases do we want to speak to both sides? I guess that would be my question. Because so let's take the example of like climate change, right? So like, do we care about being in community with climate deniers? Do we want to elevate that perspective? Do we want to present that as a both sides issue? I'm not convinced we do. I mean, I feel like there are cases, particularly in this particular moment, where it's not just that we are polarized by accident, we are polarized by design. And so, no amount of earnest come into the big tent is going to solve that problem, when what's actually happening is folks are sort of weaponizing particular extremist viewpoints to achieve particular political ends. And so I think in cases like that, for me, I wouldn't choose to be a bridger between those worlds. I would probably double down on like, how do I create visualizations that can support, creative, interesting, either micro or macro action on climate mitigation or adaptation. Like, that's where I would throw my own energy and weight. And I actually think that we have to make some of these political choices. Like, there are certain times that call on us to be political. And I would actually argue that this is a moment, like this moment of politics is that moment. So we are seeing the rollback of human rights, of civil rights, all sorts of policies that were huge wins for us, sort of just democratically speaking, as a society in the US, to realize our stated goals of equality and democracy. We're seeing those rights being rolled back. I'm throwing my own weight in behind the restoration of the rights.
So I've got a question from Niels, and that is, what is specific to data visualization or the use of visualization that triggered your doubts? Or are they triggered by the underlying research questions?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, I think it was what I was reading. So I've been reading Eve Tuck and Maggie Walter. I've been reading a lot of scholarship on Indigenous data sovereignty, on Indigenous knowledges. Also been reading Latin American feminist authors and different authors about, particularly feminist authors who theorize violence, who try to think about like, why is there violence? Where does it come from? Who try to build taxonomies of it. And so that's why I was that's why I was struck by these visualizations, which often I would say are well-meaning. Like, I think often these visualizations of inequality that we see, they're not intending to do any harm. But I think we do have to ask these questions of like, are they actually doing? I mean, I think when we showed visualizations of inequality, ostensibly, we want to mitigate that in some way. We want to reduce it. We want to close the wealth gap. We want to achieve gender parity in computer science. Those goals are not really objectionable. But are those visualizations actually helping us move towards those goals? And that's where I wasn't sure after reading this other scholarship and these other approaches, you know, kind of thinking about how do we merge those things. So those were where the doubts were coming from, is like trying to marry this thing over here with that thing over there, which for me is often the most productive way of honestly undertaking scholarship, is like read a bunch of things and say, okay, how does this apply to something that I care about? And I'm still, as you can see, sort of trying to reconcile these things and integrate these things. And sometimes I think they're not integratable too. And also that's okay. So, yeah.
I think we're in our last minute, and I guess I'm just going to do a quick sort of summary of the Slido and say, is there any suggestions that you have for us as a visualization community to do better in this space and to get involved?
No, I would just love to see all those questions I threw out answered. So I propose all of those. But no, for real, I would be very interested in all those questions. And in general, I'm also really interested in like sort of how does the VIS, you know, I know this community comes out of sort of scientific VIS, sort of how do we also expand to think about these sort of social science, humanities, and arts concerns, and look at sort of what's the role of public visualization, how's vernacular visualization being used, and so on and so forth. So I feel like there's just so much that I see for potential for further conversations. So thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was really amazing. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your thoughts and ideas with our community.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we are going to now also just please do continue the conversations on Discord. I think there's so much to do here. So I think we are now going to move to the closing. Let me just find my window. Sorry. Ah, thank you, Rita. I had it open and then lost it. So yeah, welcome to the closing. I really had a great time this week, though it would have really been more fun in person, but that's what next year is for, I guess. So I just want to do some remarks on behalf of Paul and Remco and myself. So go ahead, next slide, Rita. Specifically, we want to thank Lane Harrison, our outgoing program chair, for all the hard work that he's done in the last couple of years. Also, our outgoing tech chairs, John and Harry, they have done an amazing job in transitioning to fully virtual this last week and making this thing run as smoothly as it did. So thank you. Also, thank you to our outgoing web chairs, Steve, Dylan, and Janos. This website was really great, and I know that there's been a lot of work that's been going on in the background, and just so much thank you. I don't think we definitely couldn't have done it without any of you. Next slide. More background heroes, our program chairs, Kate Isaacs, Michelle, and Lane. Thank you. Our finance chairs, Loretta, Maria, and Bhavana, who are always keeping this thing going and are doing so much work throughout the year, even during the transition from general chair. So it's amazing how much effort is being put in. And then finally, really special thanks to Kathy Park, who did an amazing turnaround from our original venue to our downtown Tampa venue, getting that contract signed in less than a week, and then of course, helping us get out of it. So thank you. Next slide. Finally, such amazing thanks to our student volunteers. They are definitely running around in the background, and it is really sad that we didn't get a chance to meet them all. But an amazing work. We could not do it without our student volunteers. So thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it off to Rita to talk to us from the VEC.
Okay, thank you, Kristi. So I will try to be very brief. Mostly VEC wants to say thank you to everyone who is making this event happen every year and by volunteering their time. I would like to start with some overdue acknowledgements. to the incredible teams that we have had in the past few years, to the general chairs of I+II+III VIS 2022, David Ebert, Daniel Zafir, and Hendrik Strobelt, which stepped in on a very short notice and ran a great event during a very challenging time. To the general chairs of I+II+III VIS 2023, Tim Dwyer, Sarah Goodwin, and Michael Wybrow, which picked up the baton and organized the very first I+II+III VIS in Australia. And a very special thank you to the general chairs of 2024, Paul Rosen, Kristi Potter, and Remco Chang, which we all agree have done an incredible job facing unexpected challenges and managing to run a successful and smooth event despite working under a great deal of pressure. So thank you for your time and dedication. Also, we would like to highlight that to host VIS is a multi-year planning effort. So a very special thank you to Paul Rosen, who spent 2 years to bring VIS to Tampa. He made the impossible happen, and the fact that we even have a conference today is thanks to him. So if you see him next time, try to buy him a drink. Finally, we would like to thank our outgoing VEC and VSC co-chairs, Ross Maciejewski and Petra Isenberg. Thank you for leading 2 committees at the core of I+II+III VIS, and it is always an honor to work with you both. So we have prepared, given the circumstances, we have prepared certificates of appreciation, which will be given by email to all recipients shortly after the end of this of the event. Now, finally, please do remember that I+II+III VIS is driven almost entirely by volunteers. If you can provide your availability and your time, then the volunteer form is linked to the QR code and can also be found on the I+IIIVIS.org website. The organizing committee for next year is mostly set, but you can still provide your availability. We may need replacements, and it is good to engage now for future VIS editions. We also got to the program committees. Reviewers are an essential part of a successful conference. Also consider nominating your colleagues or yourself for VEC or VSC. And please consider becoming a general chair. On this note, our future conference venues will be Vienna, Austria next year, and you will be hearing from the general chairs soon. We also have plans for Boston in 2026, and 2027 is being finalized. Check back at the I+IIIVIS.org website in the coming months. For 2028, please consider hosting VIS, submit a bid. We are looking forward to have applications and get the ball rolling. So that is all from the back, and thank you all. I'm passing the stage to Johanna, I believe.
Thank you very much. Good evening from Vienna. I would like to give you some details on the organization of the VIS 2025 in Vienna and Austria. Most important one, the dates. So VIS 2025 will take place in November 1st to November 7th. November 1st is the doctoral colloquium, and then a 2nd and 3rd workshops, and then we start with the conference on November 4th. Next slide, please. There is a list of the most livable cities in the world. The cities that show up there, they're very similar every year. The ranking changes a little bit. And the nice thing is that we already visited 2 of these cities. So we already had VIS 2019 in Vancouver. We have been to Australia and Melbourne, which is also a very high-ranked city. And now finally we will move to the first place, to Vienna, Austria, which is ranked as the most livable city in the world in 2024. Next one. Vienna is the capital of Austria. It's a very old city. Its history dates back to the Roman Empire, so there are a lot of old and well-known historic sites to be visited in the city. Vienna is also known for its culture, for food that you can find here. and also very modern sites that you can find here. So I'm pretty sure that you will find something interesting in the city if you would like to visit the city during VIS. Next one. These are the 4 people that will bring VIS to Vienna. So it's myself, it's my dear PhD supervisor Edi Gröller from the TU Wien, my colleague Ghoniem, also from the VIS, and Bara. We are very happy to have her on board as well, because she already organized EuroVIS in an extraordinary way, and we are very happy to have her in the team. Next one. Austria and also Vienna is located in Central Europe. So for next year, we will move to Europe again. And you will find it very easy to reach the city, basically. So there are a lot of flight connections, direct flight connections, and even more if you also consider the flight connections that go over Frankfurt or Munich. So it's very easy to come here. Vienna is also very well connected via train to several other cities in Europe. And also if you would like to take the car or the bus, Vienna is with the central location within Europe, it's very well connected to the major roads and streets. So it's pretty easy to find your way to Vienna next year. Next slide. The conference itself will take place in a convention center. The convention center is called Austria Center Vienna. It's a very large convention center that can host up to 22,000 people. Of course, we don't need that much, so we just reserve 2 floors in the convention center. But they have a lot of, I think we can go also to the next slide. Here we have some impressions of the convention center. So they have very large rooms available for the plenary sessions. They also have a lot of space available for visit receptions, poster sessions. There is also space available for meetings. This is the so-called business lounge. So if you would like to chat to each other, sit down and have a coffee together, this is also possible. And the nice thing at the Austria Center is that all rooms, apart from the larger one, from the plenary room, all rooms also have daylight. So it's a very convenient location and big enough for this, definitely. Next slide. VIS 2025 will be certified as a so-called green event. This is a certification that is a certificate that is issued by the city of Vienna to events that try to keep the CO2 footprint as small as possible. So we will encourage you to use sustainable mobility, and we will also, the venue itself also is known to reduce to a very good waste management, so to reduce waste. And yeah, we will try to get this certificate for VIS 2025 as well. Next one. Some notes on hybrid and virtual possibilities. So our focus of planning this conference is definitely of having an in-person event. So we are really focusing on seeing you in Vienna. That would be really great. We will monitor the need for hybrid and virtual sessions. We also will offer a virtual session for virtual presentations. And we will also record the opening, the best paper session, and the closing session. And if there is a need for hybrid, please let us know during the organization process, but really also reconsider why you would want to have a hybrid session, because we would really be happy to see you in Vienna and to have an in-person conference again where we can really see each other, talk to each other, and have a lot of conversations on site. That would be really nice. Next one. Some locations. So this is Hall Vienna. The city center is in the middle. So this is the historic part of the city where you would go to if you're a tourist. So here you will find the main sites. And the venue is located a little bit outside. So the question is how to get there. That's on the next slide. So there is a direct subway connection from the city center to the convention center. This is the U1 subway line. And we will encourage you to really use public transport to reach the conference venue. So if your hotel is close to the city center, or in any other area in Vienna, if you're searching for accommodations, it's recommended that you stay somewhere close to the U1 subway line, because then you really have a direct connection to the convention center. And it's really easy to reach the venue then. Your badge, yeah, that's fine. Your badge will be a ticket for the public transport system in Vienna. So you don't have to buy any ticket. If you're a registered participant, then you can just use your badge, and you can use all the subway lines, tram lines, bus lines, whatever we have in Vienna. And you don't need to take care of buying a ticket and something like that. And then it's also easy to actually get around and to reach the convention center by subway. Next one. Some more locations. So we plan to have the VIS reception in the city center. That's on the next slide. We would like to do it in the city hall. If you're organizing an event that is large enough, approximately more than 500 people, then you can apply for a reception in the city hall. We can only do that half a year before, so we don't know yet whether we will also get a slot there. But if yes, it would be really nice to have the reception there. Next one. Next location that is important to be found is the location of the conference din. It's a little bit outside. So there you see it's important that you have a ticket for the public transport. So by public transport, it's really easy to reach all those locations. The next one. So the conference dinner, we plan that it will take place in the Otterkringer Brewery. This is the place where Otterkringer is still brewed nowadays, but they don't use the whole space of the brewery anymore. So they rent out the available space to events, and it's a very nice location where we plan to have the conference dinner. Contracts are not signed yet, but if that doesn't work out, we will find another nice location. Thank you. Next slide. And now 2 calls for action. This is the first one. We designed some logos, and we would like to have your opinion on them. So please join us in the logo voting contest. There are several color schemes that you can assign to Vienna in a way, and we would like to find out what is your favorite, because this color scheme will also then define the color scheme of the slides and of the website. So yeah, just join us in this logo voting, and we are happy to see your preferences. And the next one is also a call for action. There are other things also going on in Vienna. So the VIS gives away an award every 2 years, the Visual Computing Award. So if you have some work that supports the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is within the area of visual computing, consider submitting an award submission. We will also afterwards post the link in Discord. All right, and that's it from my side. We are very happy to welcome you in Vienna next year. If you have any question, contact us on Discord or write us an email, and let's make this a nice event in Vienna next year. Thank you.
So, hi everyone. So it looks like you would have 2 chances to come to Europe next year. So the second chance is to come to EuroVis 2025 in Luxembourg, and that will be the first week of June 25. The website of the conference is already up, and the most important dates are published. So please take a look and join the fun in Luxembourg. So of course I'm not doing this alone. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to have help from my colleagues Fintan McGee, Valérie McKeel, and Roderick McCall. Next, please. And like Vienna, Luxembourg is also very centrally located in Europe. We are about 1 hour of flight away from major airports in Europe, London, Frankfurt, and Paris, and 2 hours away from most of Europe. So if you are coming from overseas, you are 1 hop away from the airport of Luxembourg. Next slide, please. So Luxembourg, of course, is known as a financial place, but it's more than that. So the country is over 1,000 years old. with over 70 castles that you can visit if you like this kind of tourism. And there is also a very nice philharmony with over 400 shows or performances every year. So it's also a cultural place. Next slide, please. And there is also a lot of green scenery. Some places, there is a region, Luxembourg, identified as Little Switzerland. So you can also be hitchhiking and doing a lot of things outside of the city itself. Please, next slide. Yes, so, and the city itself has this blend of old and new parts. So you have the business quarter at the top right, but also then the lower part of the city with old barrackments and more historical places. Public transportation in Luxembourg is completely free. So that is something that is very convenient. Next slide, please. So please come, submit your papers to Euroviz and look up the details on the website. Thank you very much.
All right, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Really appreciate everyone's hard work, but we are officially over. So see y'all next year in Vienna. Bye.